Hey there. It's great to have you with us for a deep dive into a topic that's been making headlines lately: the military balance between Israel and Iran. We're looking at a recent report comparing their capabilities, and let me tell you, the numbers are eye-opening.
You're right, it's a fascinating comparison. What's really interesting is that just looking at the sheer size of their militaries doesn't give you the full picture. It's like comparing apples and oranges, each with its own strengths.
Right, so it's about more than just who has the bigger army or the most missiles. We need to look deeper, right? Like, what can you tell us about the money each country is putting into their military?
That's a great place to start because it reveals a lot about their strategies. The report highlights a significant gap in military spending. Israel allocated over $23 billion in 2022, while Iran spent roughly $6.8 billion.
Wow, that's more than 3 times the amount. So what does that kind of financial muscle translate to on the ground?
It gives Israel what's called a qualitative edge. Essentially, they can afford to develop and purchase state-of-the-art technology, advanced weaponry, and invest heavily in training their soldiers to a very high standard. Think of it as having the best tools and the expertise to use them effectively.
So in a sense, they're going for a smaller, more technologically advanced force.
Exactly. Now, Iran tackles this disparity a bit differently. They have a massive manpower advantage with an active military force of around 525,000 compared to Israel's 170,000. And that's not even counting their reserve forces.
So it's a classic quality versus quantity situation. Is that how this conflict is shaping up, at least in terms of military might?
It's definitely a factor. However, we need to consider how these numbers translate to actual capabilities on the battlefield, which is where things get really interesting.
Okay, so we're talking about different approaches to military power, but how does this actually play out when we're talking about things like fighter jets and missiles? What are we looking at there?
Well, in terms of air power, Israel definitely has a technological edge. They've got a modern air force with a mix of domestically produced fighter jets like the F-16s,
Right.
as well as American-made F-35s.
Yeah.
Which are some of the most advanced fighter jets in the world.
Right.
Plus, they have sophisticated helicopters like the AH-64 Apache, known for their attack capability.
I've heard those F-35s are incredibly stealthy. Isn't that a game changer in terms of air superiority?
Absolutely. They're designed to be very difficult for enemy radar to detect, which gives Israel a significant advantage in any potential air conflict. On the other hand, Iran relies heavily on older aircraft, many dating back to the Soviet era, along with some newer models acquired from China and Russia. While they're trying to modernize their fleet, they're still playing catch-up in this area.
So when it comes to planes, Israel seems to have a clear upper hand technologically. What about missiles? Both countries are known to have a considerable arsenal.
You're right. Both countries have invested heavily in missile technology, but with different approaches. Israel has developed the long-range Jericho-3 ballistic missile, which can reach targets up to 6,500 kilometers away.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that's almost the distance from New York City to London. This kind of range gives Israel the ability to strike almost anywhere in the Middle East and parts of Europe if needed.
Wow, that's a powerful deterrent. What about Iran's capabilities in this area?
Iran's most potent missile is the Shahab-3, with a range of around 1,300 kilometers, capable of reaching Israel and other countries in the region. They also possess a variety of other ballistic and cruise missiles, which they've showcased in military exercises and even used in strikes against ISIS targets. But here's where Israel's strategic thinking really comes into play. They've invested heavily in a multi-tiered missile defense system.
You mean a system designed to actually shoot down incoming missiles? Tell me more about that, because that sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie.
It might sound like science fiction, but it's very real, and it's a game changer in this conflict. Systems like Iron Dome, David Sling, and Patriot missiles are all part of this defensive shield. They're designed to intercept and neutralize missiles of different ranges and capabilities.
So even if Iran were to launch a barrage of missiles towards Israel, there's a good chance many of them wouldn't even reach their targets.
That's exactly right. This defensive system is one of Israel's key advantages. It significantly reduces their vulnerability to missile attacks, and that's a crucial factor to consider. It also adds another layer of complexity for Iran because they can't be certain about the effectiveness of a large-scale missile attack.
This is all incredibly fascinating. We've talked about fighter jets, missiles, and even missile defense systems. But there's another aspect of this conflict that I find particularly intriguing, and it's often overlooked in these kinds of comparisons: intelligence agencies. The report briefly mentioned Israel's Mossad and their alleged activities within Iran. What can you tell us about that side of things?
You've hit on a critical aspect of this conflict that often happens in the shadows. While we often focus on the hardware, the intelligence game is just as important, if not more so, in this situation.
It's like a whole other battlefield, right? One that's shrouded in secrecy and espionage.
Exactly. And it's incredibly difficult to get accurate information given the clandestine nature of these agencies. However, there's no doubt that both countries heavily invest in intelligence gathering and covert operations.
So while we can analyze military equipment and troop numbers, this hidden dimension of intelligence gathering adds a layer of unpredictability.
Absolutely. These agencies play a crucial role in shaping the dynamics of the conflict. They can provide vital intelligence that could disrupt enemy operations, give early warnings of potential attacks, or even influence events within the other country. It's a constant game of cat and mouse with extremely high stakes.
This whole discussion about intelligence operations just adds another layer of complexity to an already complex situation. It's like trying to solve a multidimensional puzzle with hidden pieces we don't even know about. But taking a step back, what does all this mean for the average person trying to understand the current state of the Iran-Israel conflict? It feels like there's so much to consider.
You're absolutely right. It's a lot to take in. And that's why it's crucial not to get bogged down in just the military hardware comparisons. As we've discussed, while those numbers are important, they don't tell the whole story.
So what are some of the other key factors we should be keeping in mind as this situation unfolds? What else is shaping the dynamics of this conflict beyond just military might?
One word: geopolitics. We need to remember that both Iran and Israel operate within a complex web of regional alliances and rivalries. These relationships have a significant impact on their actions and strategies.
Right. It's not as simple as just two countries facing off. There are other players on the field that can influence events. Could you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Consider Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. These groups are often referred to as proxy forces because they act as extensions of Iran's influence in the region, challenging Israel from multiple fronts.
So Iran is trying to exert pressure on Israel indirectly through these groups.
Precisely. It's a way for Iran to project power and keep pressure on Israel without engaging in a direct, full-scale conflict. It's a complex and dangerous game, and it adds a whole other dimension to this conflict.
And Israel has to consider how to respond to these groups, knowing that they have ties to Iran. It's a delicate balancing act, for sure.
Exactly. Any miscalculation on either side could escalate the situation very quickly. This is why understanding the broader geopolitical context, the network of alliances, rivalries, and the motivations of each player is essential to grasping the full picture.
It certainly makes for a fascinating, albeit unsettling, case study in international relations. As we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything else our listeners should be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months regarding this conflict? Any final thoughts you want to leave them with?
I think the most crucial question we're all grappling with is, could this simmering tension boil over into a full-fledged war? And what role would international actors like the United States play in such a scenario? These are questions with no easy answers, but they're definitely worth pondering as we watch this situation unfold.
It's a sobering thought for sure. But as you've shown us today, understanding the intricacies of this conflict requires looking beyond the headlines and delving into the complexities of military capabilities, intelligence operations, and the broader geopolitical chess game being played. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those questions coming, stay informed, and we'll be back with another deep dive into a fascinating topic soon.